Joseph Smith the prophet was a translator and revelator. There were two types of books that he produced. The first type was when he was revealing things directly from God to us in our day. Like, for example, the Doctrine and Covenants, where either he was revealing things or Jesus Christ was talking directly through him. So those kinds of documents are books that originate in our dispensation, in our time period. The other type of books that he produced were books that were written in ancient times by other people. So he became the person to transmit the information from those ancient books to our day. One of those ancient books is the Book of Abraham, and it's found in the Pearl of Great Price. When I translate something from the Spanish language into English, I'm transferring information directly from a document that contains the information that I'm moving from one language to another. When Abraham first wrote his book in the ancient times, whenever that was, probably 2000 BC or 1800 BC, he wrote a book that contained the information that he was writing. In other words, when I write something down in English now, it represents the sounds that I speak as if I'm speaking them. Each letter that I write represents a sound that could come out of my mouth. That is a text that runs from one sound to another. Each letter runs and contains a representation of sounds. So for the most part, when we have information in modern languages that represent information that we're trying to present, each letter that we have represents a sound. In ancient times, this was the case when people were writing the Bible, for example. It was that contained documents that would have text that would represent sounds that could be spoken. So every letter would generally represent a sound. It's true that Abraham produced a document like this in ancient times. But there are different kinds of information represented by symbols. And it's not always something where letters represent sounds spoken, one sound after another, where each letter represents a sound. In Utah, for example, if you go to any place that contains rock art, there are a bunch of pictures. That rock art, most of the time when Native Americans come and do some kind of interpretation of those pictures on a wall, on a rock wall, they tell you the story because that story has been passed down to them, and they know what those pictures are meant to represent. Those pictures don't have something like letters, where those letters spell out something that's representative of each sound spoken in a word. That's a different kind of representation of a story. Those things, as they present them, may have something to do with the words spoken, but they may only be representative of some kind of pictures that show something about that story. To get more specific, for example, if you have something like if you're trying to produce a document, you might add illustrations to it. And the words in that document that accompany those illustrations might tell something about those illustrations. But the illustrations help convey information sometimes that spoken words cannot represent. If we look at the document that Joseph Smith produced for the Book of Abraham, we find that there are picture representations in with the rest of the text. Along with the pictures that Joseph Smith said represented this or that or the other in his explanations, we have a text that actually tells the story of Abraham. But like I say, if we focus on just the pictures that go along with that, those pictures have explanations where Joseph Smith was telling us what they're meant to represent. Without those explanations, we're left with just having to guess what they represent. To the ancient Egyptians, they had a certain representation that was the cultural meaning for them, that you could say was the regular way to use them. When ancient priests put together a certain document, they did something similar to what an ancient Native American was doing when he produced nothing but pictures to represent some kind of history or some kind of story or some kind of mythology. So those priests had a type of language that was much more easy to use for picture representationalism. The reason for that is if you go to any Egyptian pyramid or ancient city, you'll see that the writing looks a lot more like just a bunch of pictures of things. And this was deliberate because those pictures originally were just representations of things. But as time went on, the Egyptians started to use those symbols to write out their representations of how they would speak as well. But the nature of those symbols never stopped being just pictures at their core. So when Joseph Smith came upon a document that was helpful to him, that document contained a bunch of pictures, but also each and every thing on that was not only a representation of a certain sound, but it had a secondary usage that was representative of pictures of things and pictures of actions and pictures of this or that or the other. So we find in Joseph Smith's notebooks, when he was translating, he would take a symbol that was representative of something at its core, where it was a picture of something, even if it was just a cursive representation of that symbol that's a picture of something, and he would line it up with English text like a dictionary, where the symbol on one side, on the left side of the page, was ultimately a symbol that was meant to be a picture, or representative of a picture of something, and on the other side he would give the explanation. This is exactly the same thing that he was doing when in the pictures that go along with the Book of Abraham that we're mostly familiar with, he would put a little number next to one of the little pictures inside of, the larger representation, and to the side of it he would have the number and English text explaining what it is. And so this is no different than a Native American taking you out to some place in Utah, like I say, with rock art, and giving an explanation of what the pictures are meant to represent. So when Joseph Smith was transmitting the story of Abraham, he was doing it using symbols that are meant to be more like pictures than regular text that would represent sounds spoken. And because of that, it requires this kind of explanation text to go along with those symbols. That's the type of thing that we're dealing with when we look at Joseph Smith's translation notebooks. You would notice, if you look at them, that these symbols, sometimes being Egyptian symbols that Egyptians would use to write text with, that you could go look up the meanings of those symbols in Egyptian dictionaries and find what the meanings are to them. If you do that for each and every one of those, that gives you something that you can use to compare the explanation that Joseph Smith attached to each one of those symbols. When Hugh Nibley did this with the Egyptian symbols in these picture representations that go along with the Book of Abraham, he found that when he would look up the Egyptian meanings of picture that often Joseph Smith's explanation had some kind of relationship with the general cultural meaning of that picture, the general mythological or cultural meaning to the Egyptians of that picture. However, it's usually, Joseph Smith's explanation is usually something that's more specific, but yet it has something that lines up with that usual usage of those pictures. And so we can see when they line up, maybe it's better to say that they have a clear relationship. And so when you put those two together, you can see the patterns that they share. Okay, and it goes to show that that Joseph Smith was employing generalized pictures with generalized meanings, and he would use more specific wording to make it even more specific of how those things were being intended, or how the usage that they were being intended for in the case of Abraham. And the same thing goes with these other symbols that Joseph Smith was using in his notebooks. A good representation, or maybe I should say a good example of this kind of representation, is the case of when Joseph Smith was using the reed leaf symbol. And by this I mean, if you go to any place in the world where there's a river, and on the side of that river, if you have plants growing, many times you'll see reeds. And so they're like, this leaf coming up right out of the ground by a river. Okay, that's the type of picture that we're talking about. The Egyptians would draw pictures representing the leaf of a reed plant. Okay. Joseph Smith's translation, so to speak, of that picture, or I should say his explanation for how that was being used in that case, was land of the Chaldees. What does that mean? Who are the Chaldees, and what does their land have to do with a leaf? Well, that's like asking what the maple leaf has to do with Canada. The maple leaf is used on the Canadian flag. It's a representation of some of their industry. It's a representation of the fact that Canadians, lots of their industry has to do with maple syrup and so forth. And so maple trees are a big thing. So they have the maple leaf on their flag. So what would a reed have to do with the ancient land of the Chaldees? Well, the ancient land of the Chaldees was a place where there were a bunch of reed plants in the deltas of the rivers that are in Mesopotamia, the land of the Chaldees. Mesopotamia, southern Mesopotamia, is the place where the Chaldees lived. These people were also known as the Kassites, and the name for their country, as they pronounced the name, was Karduniash. Joseph Smith, in his notebook, represented this name as Chalcedoniash, but it's just another pronunciation of the same word, Carduniash. The ancient Sumerians who lived in that same place called that place the land of reeds. Their name for it was Kian Gi, or the land of reeds. You can see why they would choose to represent their the name of their land using a picture of a reed leaf, because it's only logical that just like the Canadians use a leaf to represent their land, these people were using a leaf of a plant to represent their land, because that was very common in their land. It was something that people associated a lot with their land. Other names of that same area are Sakan and Sumer. Okay, and Sakan is from an ancient Iranian language to represent the land of the Kassites, or the land of the Chaldees. Joseph Smith represented this word as Zakion, but it's the same word, it's Sakan. It's just another pronunciation of the same word. So he called this land in his translation notebook Chalcedoniash, or Zakion Hiash. These are ancient names for the land of the Chaldees, and the land of the Chaldees was represented by a leaf. So you can see why Joseph Smith was led by the Holy Ghost to choose out of this document the picture of the leaf as used by an ancient Egyptian to represent the land of the Chaldees. So when I say that this is something where Joseph Smith would take symbols that are also pictures of things, take that picture or symbol that is representational of a picture, put it on one side, and then put an explanation of that usage of that symbol. This is exactly what I'm talking about. And so for it, it's interesting to note that, like I said before, every Egyptian picture like this that's also usable as some kind of symbol for writing out text, sometimes they can use those symbols in more than one way. This particular symbol, the leaf, the reed leaf, can also be used in Egyptian to represent their I or Y sound in their alphabet. And so the fact that that symbol is also used to represent a sound when used to write out text, that's the only thing that the anti-Mormons are focusing on when they talk and make the accusation that Joseph Smith could not translate. They are not focusing on Joseph Smith's actual usage. This is why the study of semiotics comes in, a branch of science that has to do with human communication, because symbolic usage of things that have to do with picture usage of symbols is different than using symbols to represent sounds that we use when we write out text that's representational of the sounds that could also be spoken. These people don't seem to care that Joseph Smith was using these symbols in a different way. And the reason he was doing so is because the Holy Ghost was leading him, putting thoughts in his mind that were actually transferred from the minds of the ancients, of how those ancient people were using these symbols, how those ancient Egyptian priests were using these symbols. In other words, they had more than one way to use them. It's that simple. And so when we focus on Joseph Smith's way of actually using these things, instead of trying to find fault, then we start to actually see that there was an actual basis for what kind of human communication these things represented, as Joseph Smith was using them in his translation notebooks. So you can see that by itself, a picture of a reed is not something that you can just stare at and look at and say, oh, well, this is land of the Chaldees. That's something that had to be communicated by the Holy Ghost, because the picture of a leaf doesn't contain the message. It doesn't spell out. It doesn't have a big representation of a bunch of sounds the way we would speak to tell a story this way. It's more like rock art. It's more like the kind of communication with pictures when they're used in rock art. Okay? And so this is what I'm talking about, where if you actually do an analysis of the type of representationalism that was being used in Joseph Smith's notebooks, this is the kind of thing that you actually come up with when you take it seriously, and not just say, like an anti-Mormon, oh, Joseph Smith didn't know what he was talking about, because when we look at what these symbols actually spell out, they have some other text entirely than the Book of Abraham. Well, the Book of Abraham text is not contained in these symbols. The text itself is not contained in the way the symbols would if they represented a bunch of sounds running together to represent sounds as if they were how they would be if they're spoken. That's just not the way these things were being used when they were meant to communicate the ideas of the Book of Abraham. And so it's easy to say, oh, look at what these things spell out in Egyptian. Well, it's not so easy to recognize that there's a whole different way that these things are being used to communicate ideas. And that's what Joseph Smith was actually doing when he had to actually get revelation of the usage of these symbols, instead of just somebody saying, oh, well, that's just a picture of that thing. No, what was the intent? This is like in the Book of Mormon, Ammon and his brethren going to the Lamanites, and Ammon standing before King Lamoni and knows his thoughts. It's because the Holy Ghost is transmitting the thoughts from the mind of Lamoni into the mind of Ammon, and he knew his thoughts. That's what we're talking about when Joseph Smith translated the intent of the ancients. And that's something that is not contained in just pictures. Okay, that's something that has to be transmitted by the Holy Ghost. So the fact that the Book of Abraham, papyrus as we have it today, is just a bunch of these pictures used to represent things, it's because we do not have the original thing that Abraham wrote out, where he represented the actual text as he would have spoken it. We had something else that was a bunch of pictures represented to go along with text. Okay, this is like I say, if you have a picture that illustrates something in a book, it requires explanation. It requires somebody to tell you what the intent was, even though the picture can tell a story to a degree. This is what we're dealing with. This is the type of thing. There's a lot more complexity going on, where certain symbols would be dissected and divided up, and other things would be derived from those symbols. But that's not something that we need to get into right now, because the same principles work for those dissections of symbols as well. We're totally talking about picture usage and picture representationalism, okay? Because every Egyptian symbol at its heart is a picture of something. Thanks.